Ingersoll Lockwood's Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog Bulgar. Chapter 5. Bulgar helps me with my packing, shows the dog putting things into a suitcase, true portraits of Bulgar and me as I appeared in my oriental dress. The dog has an eloquent cushion, and he stands over the dog with a comically small head, an almost chef sort of hat, looking like some sort of emperor. As I appeared the day after my rescue by Bulgar, his right arm is in a sling, the same outfit, and his left eye is covered by a patch. Now, in a different context, you might be able to put some sort of Antichrist spin on that, right? The little Baron makes friends with Go Whiz and his band of wind eaters. There's a row of huts, palm trees, a sun or moon in the background. The view is between two mountains. And his dog is on his right as he talks to them. And the shadows look as if they're from different times of the day. Preparations for my first voyage. The elder Baron selects the port from which I am to sail. Description of Port No Man's Port, how I escaped its quicksands, whirlpool and Thor's hammer, becalmed on the southern seas, I rescue my ship in a wonderful way, land ho! Something about a beautiful island, I leave my ship and start for the interior, how I fell in with some most extraordinary beings, description of them. They leave me to go and request permission of their chief to present me at his court, how I thought myself attacked by a band of gigantic beings, my strange mistake. They proved to be the same beings I had met the day before. What had caused the transformation? The land of the wind eaters. I am conducted to the court of Ztwish. More about the curious people, the chief's affection for me, the bursting of the babies. Go Whiz becomes my enemy. I grow thin. Queen Fu wants me to marry Princess Poof Fa. To regain my flesh, I teach the wind eaters to catch fish. Terrible accident resulting from a fire I had kindled. Go Whiz demands my death. Ztwish refuses. The furious brawler tries to slay the chief and is himself slain by Ztwish. To avoid the marriage with Poof Fa, I send Bulgar back to the ship and then escape in the night, too weak to bear the fatigue. I am overtaken. Enmeshed in the nets of the wind eaters and nearly beaten to death, Bulgar rescues me. The relief party from my ship come up with me. I reach the coast, and after a short rest, sail for home. I threw myself, now heart and soul, into the task of making ready for my first voyage. Bulgar was not slow to understand what all the hurry-scurry meant. He was delighted at the prospect of a trip to distant lands where life had less monotony about it. By the hour, he would sit and watch me at my labors, and from time to time, to please him, I pointed out articles lying here and there about the room and bade him fetch them, which he invariably did, with many manifestations of pleasure at being permitted to help his little master. In fact, everybody lent a hand most kindly, so that to my great satisfaction, I was left more time for the study of navigation. My poor mother, the gracious Baroness, would not permit anyone else to mark my clothing. With her own slender, white fingers, she worked the crest and initials of my wardrobe. There was a matter which I turned over in my thoughts for several days, to wit, what national garb I should adopt. After long and mature deliberation, I resolved to attire myself in Oriental dress. I did so for several reasons. It had been a favorite garb of mine. In picturesque grace, it appealed to my love of the beautiful, while on the other hand, its ease and lightness made it very agreeable to one of the extreme suppleness of limb and elasticity of step. While the old manor house was being literally turned topsy-turvy, and everybody, from cook to chambermaid, sat by the ears, the elder Baron was by no means idle. He took good care, among other things, that I was well provided with wholesome reading matter, and brought me several books of maxims, precepts, reflections, thoughts, and studies, which he requested me to thrust into the empty corners of my chests. For, said he, and that, too, with a great show of reason, thou wilt have many idle hours on thy hands in calm weather. It behooves thee to feed thy mind, lest its wonderful development be checked, and thou become as an ordinary child, with no thoughts above games and picture books. My poor mother, the gracious Baroness, added to this stock of good literature by presenting me with a small volume entitled The Straight Road to Good Health, or Everybody His Own Doctor. As to my medicine chest, I gave that my personal supervision, for I was always skilled in the art of reading all kinds of symptoms, and was gifted with the rare faculty of knowing almost instinctively what remedy to give for a certain ailment, without first experimenting upon the patient by trying one thing after another, as is the custom with most people who pretend to heal sickness. Everything was going well now, and I was in the best of spirits, when the elder Baron came to me with a proposal which, for some reason, I can hardly tell why, displeased me, although it would seem that it ought to have had the opposite effect. He proposed to precede me by a week or 10 days to the North Sea, in some port of which I intended to purchase and fit out a swift, staunch vessel, purchase the vessel himself, give his personal attention to fitting her out, and shipping a crew of picked men. What could I do? If I refused his offer, it would have been tantamount to a confession of distrust on my part. Can he have in mind any project to thwart my scheme? Oh, perish the thought! But I must confess that I did not accept his proffered services without serious misgivings. This sudden anxiety on the part of the elder Baron to hurry my departure, and after having opposed it so long and so vigorously, made me a little uneasy in my mind. Before setting out for the North Sea to purchase a ship for me, the elder Baron entered my apartment and spoke as follows: "Pardon me, little Baron, for interrupting thy labors, for I perceive that thou art deep in the study of navigation. Speak, Baron, said I, looking up with a mischievous smile. That right belongs to thee. I have a last request to make, he continued in his usual calm manner. Nor is it a matter of very great importance. Rather, it is a whim, more than aught else. Thou knowest from my lips, and from the perusal of our family chronicles, that we were in ancient time very large landowners on the coast of the North Sea. We controlled several ports, were extensively engaged in trade, sending out at least a score of ships in a 12-month. One of the ports of our domain was a famous one, famous for the extraordinary character of its inlet and outlet currents, channel, etc. It was said of this port that it was more dangerous than the open sea, that vessels were really safer out of it than in it. I know not how much of truth may be in all this, but I do know that one man, an ancestor of ours, not only sailed into it, but safely out again. For thou must know that the channel by which a vessel gained admission to this port could not be used to leave it again, as the irresistible current always followed the one way, namely from the sea into this mysterious basin. To leave it, the bold mariner must trust his bark to another channel, and therein lurked the danger. It would gratify me greatly, little Baron, if thou couldst prove to the world that, no matter how difficult other captains once found, and now find it, to sail out of this port, yet to thee it offered no insurmountable obstacles. And therefore am I come to ask thee to set sail from this port. It is called, I asked carelessly, as I turned to a chart of the North Sea, Port No Man's Port, replied the Baron. I like its name, said I. Order my ship to await me there. The elder Baron arose, and bending his body with stately grace, withdrew. I accompanied him to the door, and dismissed him with most respectful obeisance. Port No Man's Port, I answered. Ah, here is the chart. The descriptive text reads as follows. Abandoned for many years, ingress easy, egress so dangerous as to mean fatal injury, if not destruction, to sailing craft. Outer channel blocked by a fearful whirlpool and swinging rock called Thor's Hammer. Inner basin, extremely dangerous from constantly shifting sands. Closed by order of the Royal Ministry of Commerce and Marine. Upon finishing the reading of these words, I sprang up and began to pace the floor, wildly and half unconsciously. The blood rushed in upon my brain. I was obliged to halt and cling to the back of a tall oak chair, or I should have staggered and fallen to the ground. Bulgar was greatly alarmed and sent up a suppressed howl of grief. I spoke to him as calmly as I could to comfort him. After a few moments, the vertigo passed off and my mind cleared up completely. Nay, it is impossible, I whispered. The elder Baron could not be guilty of bad faith to me. Away with such a thought. He errs through thoughtlessness and lack of experience. He little knows the terribly dangerous character of the task he is setting me. To him, the talks of shipwreck and death within Port No Man's Port are but the legends of old-time sailor life. He has not the faintest suspicion that his request, so lightly made, exposes his only child, son, and heir to a princely fortune and honored name, either to be engulfed by these shifting sands, sucked down to destruction by this fearful whirlpool, or crushed by a blow from Thor's hammer. And yet, why murmur? It is too late to protest. Already the elder baron has proclaimed to the world to him, proud piece of news, that his son was about to renew the old-time glories of his family. I must do one of two things: face these dangers like a man of cool, calm courage, wasn't he 8 years old, or condemn myself to a life of dull and listless activity, the magnate of a province, and not the hero of two worlds. No, the die is cast. I have said it, and it is as good as done. My ship sails from Port No Man's Port, or this body feeds its fish that day. Doubtless, my eyes brightened, and my cheeks took on a glow of crimson hue, for Bulgar, who had been listening to my soliloquy with the most pained expression on his face, as he vainly tried to get the meaning of my words, now broke out into a very lively succession of barks, bounding and springing about the room in the wildest merriment. He knew only too well that some terrible struggle had been going on in my mind. Now he realized that all was well. Faithful creature, if he could only tell his love, how he would put all human lovers to blush. As the hour drew near for me to bid adieu to the baronial hall, that good lady, the gracious baroness, my mother, suddenly thought of 1,001 things which she deemed of the very greatest importance to me. She warned me that I was not to sleep in a draught, not to partake of freshly baked bread, not to drink cold water while overheated, not to cut my fingernails too short, not to sleep with my mouth open, not to wear my underclothing longer than 1 week, not to neglect to brush my teeth, not to fail to have my hair cut with the new moon, not to strain my eyes reading by a poor light, not to swallow my food without thoroughly chewing it, not to laugh while I had food in my mouth, not to attempt to stop a sneeze, not to neglect to pare my corns, not to pick my teeth with a metal point, not to examine the end of my nose without a looking glass, not to eat meat without pepper, or vegetables without salt, not to exert myself after a hearty meal, not to stand upon my leg while it was asleep, not to walk so fast as to get a pain in my side, not to go to sleep until I had first rested on my right side, so to lower blood pressure, right? Not to fail to take a pill if I saw flashes in the dark. Well, no, just let yourself have the vision, right? Not to neglect to tie a stocking around my neck in case my throat felt sore, etc., etc., etc. When the moment came to take leave of the gracious baroness, my good mother, I was deeply moved. All the servants and retainers, from indoors and out, filed in front of me, kissed my hand, and showered blessings upon me. I may safely say that the only being present not moved to tears was Bulgar. He was so anxious to get under way that he passed an hour or so racing from the manor house to the carriage and back again in a piteous endeavor to get the procession started. Start we did, at last. 100 hands waved us a fond farewell. The stately trees that shut in the baronial hall swayed solemnly. I was glad when we rolled out of the courtyard, for I needed rest and quiet. My nerves had been on such a stretch for the past month that a change of scene brought me balm and relaxation. My journey to the North Sea was quiet and uneventful. I found my ship safely anchored in Port No Man's Port, and the elder baron there in charge of her. He introduced me to the sailing master, pressed me in his own loving arms, and with a gracious smile and stately wave of the hand, seated himself on the family couch. His only adieu was, "My son, thy wisdom comes to thee by inheritance. Thou couldst not have acquired it, therefore make a noble use of so noble a gift. Farewell." I bent my head in silence. The carriage rolled away. I stood alone. Nay, a true and loving friend was there. He looked up with his large, lustrous eyes as if to say, "Don't be sad, little master. No matter who goes, I'll stay by thee forever." Turning to my sailing master, I ordered the ship's launch to be manned, and began at once a survey of the mysterious port in which my ship lay anchored. I found it to be a roomy basin, shut in by a rock-bound shore. In places the waters slept beneath black and glassy surfaces. In others all was movement and commotion. Its waves came boiling and bubbling against the launch, with swirling masses of white sand shifting hither and thither as if condemned to perpetual unrest. The fact that my men, while fishing in different parts of the bay, often caught deep-sea fish, proved to me that Port No Man's Port was traversed by a channel from 4 to 6 fathoms in depth. The only difficulty would be to fix the boundaries of this constantly shifting path long enough to sail across the basin. I next turned my attention to the whirlpool. It marked the junction of the outer channel with the basin of Port No Man's Port. Having purchased a number of condemned hulks for the purpose of testing the strength and fury of the whirlpool, I caused a strong hawser to be rigged to a capstan on shore, and was in this way enabled to let the launch approach within a ship's length of the whirlpool with perfect safety. In truth, it was, when roused the full measure of its fury by the intrusion of any large floating body, a sight to strike terror to the stoutest heart. With a deep booming and rumble, its waters rose in tumultuous commotion, boiling, bubbling, seething, till snow-white foam covered the pool like a mantle of bleached linen. Then, lifting the intruder, which in this case was one of the hulks that I had ordered to be launched upon them, these angered waters whirled it completely around in an instant, as if exhausted by this tremendous effort. A mysterious calm sank upon the pool. The foam sheet, broken into shreds, danced gently on the rippling bosom of the waters. All was peace, save that the hulk still lay trembling like an affrighted being in the lap of this resting monster. For look, it is aroused again. Faster and faster it whirls its prey. Deeper and deeper its now wide open jaws draw down the ill-fated hulk. A terrible roar tells that the end is near. 'Tis gone. But wait, it will give up its prey again. Even now, bits of plank float seaward, dancing on the rushing waters. Soon the crumpled, broken, crushed remnants of that strong hulk will follow. This watery monster doth not feed upon what he swallows. He destroys for the mere love of destruction. Night had come now. I returned to my ship. The shifting sands and the whirlpool had uncovered their horrors, but I feared them no more. Like the horse tamer, when he has at last succeeded in thrusting the steel bit between the champing and gnashing teeth of the wild young steed, I now felt that they were conquered. And now for Thor's hammer, was my cry as I sat down beside Bulgar for a brief moment's reflection. The first streak of gray light in the east found me on deck. Thor's hammer was a huge shaft of black, flinty rock, projecting about 20 feet out of the water and ending in a hammer-shaped head. It guarded the channel where it reached the sea, standing exactly in the middle, thus forcing a vessel to pass on one side or the other side of it. Beneath the waters, this dread sentinel must have ended in a gigantic ball, which, in the flight of time, had worn a socket for itself in the bedrock of the channel. For it swung loose and free, moved by every powerful billow from side to side, threatening swift destruction to any passing craft. To speak frankly, the sight of this terrible engine of destruction appalled me. How should I escape the vigilance of this gigantic sentinel, who knows no sleep, no rest, whose blows fall with like fury on friend or foe? How shall I lull him to repose for a few brief moments? Determined to study closely the strength, the rapidity, and the character of the blows struck by Thor's hammer, I caused several huge structures of plank and timber to be erected near the position of this mighty sentinel of rock. One after the other, I ordered them to be thrown into the channel. At first, I was fairly paralyzed upon discovering that even the slight vortex caused by the drifting by of one of these wooden structures set the swinging rock in violent vibration and always towards the passing object. Judging from the effect of Thor's hammer upon these floating masses of plank and timber, a single blow would suffice to crush the very life out of my ship in spite of her unusual staunchness. I stood transfixed with dread forebodings. I could feel the beads of perspiration break from my forehead and trickle down my cheeks. Must I give up and return home, broken in spirits, humiliated, the butt of ridicule, the target of village wit, the subject of mirth and laughter in every peasant's cottage? Oh no, it cannot. It must not be. Like a flash of lightning, a thought flamed across the dark horizon of my mind. Am I not dreaming? Was it really so? One of the wooden structures still remained. Controlling my emotion, with great difficulty, I ordered it thrown into the channel and took up a favorable position to watch, once again, the wrath of the towering sentinel. In a few moments, Thor's hammer felt the coming of the craft and bent itself in impotent rage, beating the air with blows which fell faster and faster. I was right. When once Thor's hammer had begun its labor of death and ruin, it turned not from its task so long as there remained any object for it to spread its fury upon. Nor was there any escape for the ill-fated craft until it had been pounded into flinters. Hanging over it, blow followed blow, with fearful clash and clamor. Not until the poor remnant had drifted seaward did that black and flinty shaft cease its furious swinging. Turning to my sailing master, who stood with his wondering eyes fixed full upon me, I called out in a calm and careless tone, "In 3 days, skipper, if the weather is clear, we leave Port No Man's Port." A lump rose up in his throat, but he gulped it down and cried out merrily, "A, sir." And what 3 busy days they were too. My men were not long in catching something of the indomitable spirit of their new commander. I worked them hard, but I fed them well, served out grog with a liberal but wise hand, and saw that all their wants were satisfied. In turn, their wonderment became admiration, and their admiration affection. The first day, all the hands that could be spared were set to work making fish lines, with a good stout hook at one end and a cork float at the other. The lines were cut about 3 fathoms in length, and the floats were painted a bright crimson. I then gave orders to rig 3 jury masts, 1 midships and 1 fore and aft. My men set to work with a will, but I caught them several times in the act of tapping their foreheads and exchanging significant glances. But if this last order threw them into a brown study, my next had the effect of a bombshell exploding in their midst. Sailing master and all, they stood staring at me as if they were only waiting for me to annihilate them. My order was to rig a steering gear under the figurehead. A coasting vessel, which I had sent for, now came sailing leisurely into Port No Man's Port. I directed the skipper to pay her crew 3 months' extra wages and discharge them. This done, my men were ordered to lash the coaster on our starboard side. I verily believe that my whole plan, so carefully studied out, was at this point only saved from utter failure by the wisdom of my faithful Bulgar. The coaster had no sooner been lashed to our side than he sprang lightly over the railing and began to amuse himself by gambolling up and down the clear deck. Suddenly, he paused near one of the hatches and broke out into a most furious barking. I called to one of my officers to look sharp and see what the matter was. He reported in a few moments that one of the discharged seamen had been found concealed in the hold. When I threatened to put him in irons, he confessed that his design had been to cut the coaster loose as soon as our ship had drawn near to the whirlpool. It was a narrow escape. Dear, faithful Bulgar, how much we owe thee for that discovery. The 3rd day dawned bright and fair. The wind was most favorable, blowing strong offshore. At the first glimmer of light, my men were astir and on the lookout for my appearance. They greeted Bulgar and me with 3 hearty cheers. They had made up their minds that what I didn't know, Bulgar did. At last, all was ready. I nodded to the sailing master, and in a moment or so the capstan began to revolve, and the merry yo-heave-oh of the men told me that the anchor had been started. Hundreds of the lines and floats, well baited, were now cast overboard. Standing on the taffrail, glass in hand, I watched them closely and anxiously. Imagine my joy at seeing several of these crimson floats disappear like a flash, rise again, and again vanish for an instant. "The first point is gained," I cried out. "I have found the channel." Passing word quickly to the sailing master, who was in charge of the steering gear, my good vessel moved slowly out of port, no man's port, stern first, again and again, the baited lines with the crimson floats were thrown overboard. The deep water fish that swarmed the ever-shifting channel kept steadily at work. As our ship advanced, they tugged at the lines and thus kept the tortuous course plainly marked out. Glass in hand, I watched the successful working of this part of my plan. With the tingling veins and a bounding heart, a loud huzzah from my men tell me that we have cleared the shifting sands. True it is, we have crossed the basin of Port No Man's Port. Its dreaded quicksands swirl and roll in vain. It was not fated that they should engulf the little barren ship. But see, the channel narrows. The waters grow black and troubled, and hark, didn't you hear that dull roar? I spring down from the taffrail. I pass among my men and drop here and there a word of encouragement. My perfect calmness impresses them. No merry AA, sir, goes up, but I see a response in their faces. It is, we trust you. Little, Captain, speak. The dull roar grows louder and louder. The rapids catch us up and bear us along like chips on the foaming tide of a mountain stream. Our staunch vessel rocks like a toy boat. The coaster, lashed to one side, creaks and groans in its wild efforts to break away. Calling Bulgar to me, I pass the line around him and lash him firmly to the main mast, for I was fearful lest a sudden lurch might hurl him overboard. On we speed through the frightened waters. The roar is deafening. I glance at my seamen. Their bronzed faces are blanched. They cling to the shrouds and stays. Their eyes are riveted upon me. Look, the fearful whirlpool is dead ahead of us. It opens its foam-flecked jaws like some terrible monster. We leap into its very mouth. Are we lost? How can it be otherwise? As if our staunch vessel were a nutshell. The swirling, raging, whirling, battling, boiling waiters catch her up in their encircling arms, lift her high above the sea level, turn her completely around, and drop her with such terrific force that great walls of water rise on all sides and threaten to engulf the frail wooden thing. But most wondrous change, mark how she floats upon a glassy pool. The foam dances in the sunlight on the rippling waves. All is peace, where but a moment before nature raged with demoniac fury. Quick as thought, I leap into the mizzen shrouds, cut away the jury masts. They fall overboard with a crash. My men work with a mad earnestness. They know too well that every instant may be their last. Our mainsail, already hoisted, is sheeted home without a word or a cry. We are too near death to sing. See, see. The wind fills the great sail. We move. The waters seem to scent our escape. They are awaking to new fury. A deep rumble from the very bowels of the earth calls upon them to arouse from their lethargy. They reach out for us. Too late, too late. We sweep out of their reach. We are saved. We are saved. A shout goes up from 20 throats, from which fear now takes her hand. Look back. As if robbed of its prey, the whirlpool awakes with redoubled fury. 100 arm-like streams of water gush forth and pour around our good ship in vain effort to draw her back into that terrible vortex. We are drenched with clouds of spray and mist as we slowly but steadily keep on our course. Would that we were safe upon the swelling tide of the open sea, for there is still another danger to be met. Our channel suddenly narrows. I could toss a biscuit to the rocky wall, which shuts us in on both sides. Again, a deep silence falls upon ship and crew, broken only by a strange sound of rushing waters, bursting out and dying away as regularly as the swing of a pendulum. 'Tis Thor's hammer, beating the frightened waters into foam, as it sways from side to side. In spite of my effort to appear calm, I can feel my heart beat faster. A cold chill benumbs my hands. A glance ahead startles me like a blow from an unseen hand. There, with the morning sun resting on its hammer-shaped crest, swings the dreaded shaft of flinty rock, threatening instant destruction to any ship bold enough to attempt to pass it. In accordance with my orders, every sail on the coaster had been set, and her helm lashed, so as to pass to the right of Thor's hammer. "Courage, men," I cried. "Stand by all. Cut away the lashings. Cast off the tender." Then, waving my hand to the skipper, our main sail came down with a run. Everything worked like a charm. Our ship slowed up while the coaster shot ahead to her destruction. See how gallantly the doomed craft speeds on her way, for the breeze had freshened, and several gay joys, streamers and flags, which my men had run up to the topmast, fluttered in the crisp morning air. There, did you not hear that crash? Thor's hammer has struck her. Blow follows blow. Crash, crash, crash. Now is our time, our never. I was not caught napping. The moment we were clear of the coaster, I had ordered sails enough to be set to hold our ship steady on her course. Already, we drew near Thor's hammer, which is fast battering the coaster to a shapeless mass. The sea is filled with bits of plank and broken timber. Thor's hammer bends to its dread work of destruction, unmindful of our presence. What could withstand its terrible fury? Those sturdy timbers yield like twigs. Another minute, and we have the monster and his victim in our wake. Now, we're passing him. Our sails tremble from the very force of his breath. Our deck is strewn with splinters. The roar and crash are deafening. Thor's hammer bends for one last blow at the ribs and keel of its broken and disjointed victim. Hurrah, hurrah! Our good ship dips to the deep roll of the ocean's breast. We are on the open sea. Port, no man's port. Farewell. As my men looked back at the rocky gateway and the grim sentinel of Port, no man's port, they tossed their caps into the air and sent up cheer after cheer. Bulgar bounded about the deck, doing his best by most vigorous barking to testify his admiration for his little master. The sailing master drew near and, touching his cap and scratching the deck with the toe of his shoe, cried out gaily, "Bravo, little Baron! That was splendidly done. I was sure we should never get through the shifting sands, and when they were past, I was ready to swear the whirlpool would make short work of us. But when we sailed safely out of that, I drew near the tail ready to jump overboard, for I felt that nothing could save us from a blow from Thor's hammer. I've grown wrinkled and gray, facing the storms of Neptune's domain, but I never felt I had a master until now. I nodded and smiled, and quickly turned the conversation to some other topic. By the way, Skipper, said I, remember the very moment we clear the English Channel? Turn her head southward. Little Baron, was the reply, calling Bulgar to me. I now went below. I wanted to be alone. The fact of the matter is, I needed rest. The terrible strain on my nerves, caused by the hopes and fears of the past few days, began to tell upon me. Throwing myself upon a canopy, I fell into a deep sleep, from which I was awakened by the Bulgars whining and crying. The sailing master was anxiously feeling my pulse. I had slept 3 days and 3 nights. All this time, Bulgar had absolutely refused to leave my side or partake of food, although the skipper had tempted him with the daintiest morsels. His joys knew no bounds as I sprang up and shook myself into shape. Where are we, master? I cried. On the broad Atlantic. Headed dead south, little Baron, was the answer. Good. Send me a rasher of bacon and some hardtack. The Atlantic breeze has given me an appetite, and Skipper, I added, a little broiled fowl for Bulgar. And now for the land of warmth and sunshine, I murmured. Now for the home of the orange and the palm. Cold winds like me not. I am a child of the tropics, born in a land where nature works and man plays. No chill blast ever whistled its sad tune over my cradle. Let those who will spend 1/2 their lives waiting for Mother Earth to wake from her winter sleep. Freeze the body, and you freeze the brain. I am of those who love flowers better than snowflakes. Glorious Southland, I greet thee. Thy child comes again into thy arms. Oh, take him up kindly and lovingly. Southward, ever southward, my good ship sped along. By day I paced the deck to watch the dolphins at play or to observe Bulgar's amazement when a stray flying fish fell fluttering on deck. By night, with my eyes fixed upon the blazing Southern Cross, I longed for the time to come when I should set foot upon some beautiful stranded, decked out with coral branch and shells of pearl, in whose limpid waters golden fish nestle mid sea plants of not less brilliant hue. It was now 3 weeks since the last murmur of Thor's hammer had fallen on our ears. My chronometer marked high noon. Every sail was set, and our good ship careened as gracefully as a swallow that bent in its flight to touch the cool waters of some glassy lake. All of a sudden, the wind fell. Our ship stood still on the motionless sea. My pennant hung like a string. There was not air enough to lift the smoke from our galley fire. A strange, mysterious stillness weighed upon the ship and sea. I knew too well what it betokened. One of those dreaded calms, more feared by the seamen, that the buffeting gale had overtaken us. Our ship stood like one moored to a marble wharf, and as the thought flashed across my mind that days, even weeks, might pass ere the winds would lift themselves again to bear us on our way, a feeling of utter listlessness came over me. It required a great exertion for me to throw it off. I dared not let my men see aught of discouragement in my face, and yet it was a hard task. Had I not been made of stern stuff, I would have wept to see my progress stayed at the very moment victory was almost within my grasp. Again, as was the case, when the terrors of Port No Man's Port rose like demons of malignant might to shut me forever in that rock-encircled basin, did my thoughts revert to home, to the elder baron and his gracious consort, my dear mother, to the servants and retainers of the baronial hall, to the villagers and tenantry. How, oh how should I be able to face them all if I were forced to return home with the humiliating confession that my voyage had been a failure? Bulgar was the first to catch a glimpse of the shadow on my brow. He turned his dark, lustrous eyes full upon me, so pleadingly as if to say, "O little master, what aileth thee? May I not do aught to drive the dark melancholy from thy face? Thou knowest how I love thee. Teach me to help thee. My life is thine, thy grief weighs like lead on my heart. Speak to me, little master." Tenderly and lovingly, I stroked his head and spoke in softest tones to him. He was rejoiced, but still he sat and watched me, for it was impossible to deceive him by feigning to be light-hearted and unconcerned. A lot of projecting upon the dog, right? The second week found us lying like a log in a mill pond, our sails unvisited by the faintest breath of air. The sea sunken into a sleep that seemed like death. Despair sat on the faces of my men. "Rouse thee, little baron," I murmured to myself as I paced my cabin floor. "Where is thy boasted cunning? Where is thy vaunted wisdom? Nevermore say that thou art a man of projects, quick to devise and quick to perform. Thou hast lost thy hold on the spoke of fortune's wheel." "Thinkest thou so?" cried I in answer to my own thoughts. "Follow me, we shall see." With a bound I cleared the gangway. The sailing master lay asleep on the deck. The men in groups here and there looked the very picture of despair. Rousing the skipper with a vigorous tug at his belt, aided by Bulgar's frantic outburst of barking, I called out, "Avast there, skipper, asleep from overwork, pipe all hands on deck." The men came up in lively fashion, greatly amused by my cut at the sailing master, who stood rubbing his eyes, half dazed by my sudden outburst. "Send me the ship's carpenter," I continued, and catching up a piece of chalk, I drew the plan of a large box or chest nearly as long as our ship's breadth of beam, and gave the carpenter directions to build it of the strongest planks to be had on board. He and his assistants were soon at work. Turning then to the cook, I ordered him to kill the pigs and fowls we had shipped for our own supply of fresh meat, bidding him to be careful and not to lose a drop of the blood. These orders fairly drove my men wild with curiosity. The sailing master drew near and attempted to get some explanation from me, but in vain. I was too deep in thought to speak. The long box was ready in a few hours. Word now went up that I was about to abandon the ship and strive to reach land by rowing, and that this long box was to hold the provisions. The sailing master again fixed his gaze inquiringly upon me. I pretended not to notice his beseeching looks. The cook, by this time, had the fresh meat in readiness. Under my directions, it was all transferred to the long chest. the blood poured over it, and the box securely closed with a heavy plate glass lid, made up of several pieces shipped for the purpose of restoring broken lights. By this time, the men had grown so excited over this mysterious box and its still more mysterious contents that I was obliged to order them to fall back so that the carpenter and his assistants might go on with their work without interruption. The next step was to weigh the long chest with lead and to attach hoisting tackle to each end by strong iron rings. When all was ready, I called out to my men to stand by and lower it over the stern rail. Stationed so that I could watch the lowering of the long box, I was careful to sink it about 3 feet under water, and then lash it firmly to the ship's stern. I had scarcely given the word to lower away on all the sails when the ship began to move. The effect on my men was indescribable. Some turned pale and stood as if transfixed with fear. Others laughed in a wild, maniac-like way. Others, who had their wits about them, rushed to the stern taffrail to fathom the mystery. A glance was enough. It was a simple thing after all. Gradually, the others recovered their reason and hastened to join their companions and gaze down into the waters where I had lashed the long box with its glass lid and strange contents. Meanwhile, our good ship moved faster and faster through the sluggish, listless waters. A ringing cheer, 3 times repeated, went up when the mystery was fully solved. Mystery? Hear then what this mystery consisted of. In the first days of this dead calm, which settled like a terrible blanket spread over us by the hands of some unseen monster to check our advance, I had noticed that the waters swarmed with sharks of extraordinary length, that these fierce demons of the deep hung about our vessel in shoals of countless numbers, attracted by the garbage thrown overboard, and doubtless, too, by the odor of the many living beings on board the ship. When at times a particularly large supply of garbage fell into the water, so fierce was the onslaught of these ravenous monsters that they actually jarred the ship as they struck against its sides or stern, locked together like advancing cohorts of trained soldiery. Upon this hint, I acted as if I reasoned. I can only control this now wild force, which may I not make use of it to rescue my ship from a worse danger than raging storm? For far better would it be to face the howling blast and foam-crested wave than to perish from thirst, chained to the open sea by this breathless calm. Now, however, all was changed. On our good ship went, with ever-increasing speed, gliding noiselessly and swiftly through the mirror-like waters. My device worked far better than I had dared to dream, for as the fresh blood began to trickle through the crevices of the long box, the ravenous sea monsters were almost maddened by its smell and taste. The largest and fiercest pressed forward in serried ranks, tossing their smaller companions high in the air as they took up their places with wild and eager search for prey, which lured them on, ever so near them and still ever beyond their reach. No sooner did the foremost ranks of this army of Myrmidons of the deep show signs of fatigue. Then the long lines of fresh and eager recruits darted forward, hurling their exhausted fellows right and left like bits of cork, and took up the task of following the ever-retreating prey, which, although giving out its life-blood and plainly visible to them, yet seemed to know no tiring, and sped onward and ever onward before the wild, tumultuous attack of their pushing, plunging cohorts. The moon now shone like a plate of burnished silver on the blue walls of heaven, and the deep silence of the sleeping waters was broken by the splash of those mighty bodies, glistening in her light, as they toiled and struggled to urge our vessel on its way. I could not sleep. Wrapped in a woolen cloak to shield me from the insidious dews of the tropics, I threw myself on deck with Bulgar's head pillowed on my lap. Something whispered to me that if those hunger-stricken marauders of the deep would only keep to their task till the morning sun streaked the east, my cheek would feel the breath of coming winds. And so it turned out. With the first glimmer of daylight, I caught sight of a ripple on the lake-like bosom of the ocean. At that very moment, too, I noticed that our ship was slowing up. I sprang up on the taffrail. Lo, our allies had abandoned us. Not a single follower of that riotous camp was in sight. Ah, little did they dream how they had saved ship and crew, how limitless is man's selfishness. The beasts of the field, the monsters of the deep, must minister to his pleasure, obey his commands. I had pointed out the ripple in the water, and when the first sturdy breath of wind reached us, we were in readiness to receive it. Every sail was set. My heart leaped with joy as our ship drew up to the wind, obeying her helm like a thing of life. And that was the way I saved my ship and crew from a worse danger than storm-lashed billows. From this time on, all went well. Scarcely a week had gone by when I was startled by a cry which sounded sweeter to my ears than voice of monarch to courtier. Land ho, dead ahead. Seizing my glass, I sprang up into the main shrouds and turned my gaze in the direction indicated. True it was. There it lay before us, rising from the ocean with gentle slope, its heights crowned with trees and many-colored foliage, its shores ending in long stretches of snow-white beach. Above the unknown land hung a purple mist of a deep rich tint, like the cheek of a ripe plum. As we drew near, a landlocked harbor seemed to welcome us. Not a sound or sign of life, however, came to break the deep repose which enveloped the bay and shore. Slowly and in stately bearing, our good ship sailed into the harbor and cast anchor. The radiant beauty of the land now burst upon me. 10,000 shells of pearly tints and hues glistened on the white sands, while in the limpid waters, sea flowers and foliage of the deepest crimson swayed gently with the tide. Up the sloping banks, nature seemed to be holding high carnival. No shrub or bush or tree was content to wear simple green. Each wave some blossom of richest radiance in the soft and balmy air. Here and there a brooklet came tumbling down the hillside, rippling, purling, and splashing over the moss-grown rocks in its bed. The air was heavy with the fragrance of this vast garden, so beautiful, and yet so silent and deserted. The next day, leaving my sailing master in command, I set out on a tramp, accompanied solely by my faithful Bulgar. My idea was to see if this island, for such I thought it to be, contained anything quaint and curious The further I advanced into the interior of this fair land of bright flowers, purling brooks, clear skies, and perfumed air, the more was I astonished to find that neither vine, shrub, brush, nor tree bore any berry or fruit to feed upon. And, though it was just such a land of brooks, flowers, and balmy air as some dweller of the faraway north might dream about, yet was it untrodden by the foot of man. For rare indeed is it that the people of the tropics are willing to prepare any other food for themselves than that which nature spreads before them. I now began to be thankful that I had supplied myself plentifully with dried fruits before leaving my ship to set out for a tour of the island, for such it seemed to me to be. At this moment, Bulgar halted, and raising his nose in the air, sniffed hard and long, and then fixed his dark eyes on me as much as to say, "Take care, little master. Some sort of living creatures are approaching." I had hardly time to draw one of my pistols and give a hasty glance at its priming, when with strange cries and stranger movements, a dozen or more beings of the human species sprang out of the thicket with noiseless steps and surrounded us. I raised the firearm, which I held grasped in my right hand, ready to stop the advance of this band of most curious creatures by slaying their leader, for, judging by the forbidding aspect of their faces and the terrible condition of their bodies, apparently reduced by the dread pangs of hunger to mere sacks of skin hung on frames of bone, which methought rattled at every step they took, I anticipated an instant attempt on their part to strike us down and eat us. But I was very quickly reassured, first by the fact that they bore no weapons of any kind, and second by the softness of their voices and the walking beam-like motions of their bodies, which I interpreted to mean a sort of welcome mingled with a desire to make friends with a human being of so different sort from themselves. Although I gave them to understand, or tried to do so by imitating the ducking motion of their heads, followed by an attempt to equal their performance in making a large number of very low bows, so graceful and easy that they would have done credit to a French dancing master, that they had nothing to fear. Yet they continued to back away from me as fast as I advanced. Bulgar was somewhat surprised at my eagerness to make friends with such a starved-out-looking set of creatures, and kept up a furious growling, eyeing them suspiciously as they continued the walking beam motion of their bodies, all the while backing away from me. I now found myself in front of a group of umbrella-shaped bamboo huts, into which most of them had retreated. With no little difficulty was it that I finally succeeded in coaxing them forth and convincing them that my intentions were perfectly peaceful. For a quarter of an hour or more they circled about me in silent wonder, while I, on my part, gazed in speechless astonishment at these extraordinary-looking specimens of our race. What they thought of me, you will learn as my story goes on, but how shall I ever describe them to you, so as to give you even a faint idea of their wonderful appearance? Imagine skeletons of rather small stature walking about with collapsed meal bags hung upon them, skin hanging down and folds everywhere, flapping about at every step, and you'll have some faint conception of the utterly ridiculous and grotesque look of these beings. Almost every bone in their bodies was visible beneath this thin covering. Their cheeks hung like two empty pouches on each side of their faces. Their noses stuck out like knife blades. Deep wrinkles and creases crossed and crisscrossed their faces, giving them a look of terrible melancholy and utter wretchedness. With their skeleton fingers, ever and anon they grasped a fold of skin and smoothed it out or pushed it elsewhere, as one might a loosely fitting garment. And yet, utterly wretched and melancholy as these creatures seemed to be to the eye of the looker-on, their voices were light and gay and soft as flute notes. They chatted and laughed among themselves, were full of mischief, and pointed their pencil fingers at different parts of Bulgar and my body with evident enjoyment at the sight of things so new and strange to them. Several times, while gazing upon these mournful and woebegone looking faces, and at the same time listening to their happy and childlike chatter, I broke out into a peal of laughter which was not only very ill-bred, but which invariably had the effect of causing them to fall back in disorder. Gradually, however, they grew bolder, and by means of a kind of sign language, gave me to understand that they desired to touch me. By recourse to the same common language of mankind, I informed them that I should be only too happy to gratify their requests, and proceeded to lay bare my breast and roll up the sleeves of my coat. They half repented of their foolhardiness and crowded together, interlocking their arms and legs in such a manner to save my life. I couldn't tell where one commenced and the other ended. But after a few moments' coaxing, I succeeded in persuading them to advance and lay their hands upon me. Loud outcries followed, exclamations of wonder and astonishment. As I afterwards learned, the words they uttered meant lump, chunk, stone, hard, solid. At this moment, feeling a little bit hungry, I opened my sack of dried fruit and thrust several pieces into my mouth, and now came a still more furious outburst of wonder, mingled with cries of horror and disgust. Again they retreated and tied themselves into a knot. Can it be, I asked myself, that these creatures never touch solid food? Observing now that they were consulting among themselves as to what course to pursue in regard to me, and being afraid that they might take it into their hands to escape into the thicket, for they were as quick in their movements as sprites and phantoms, I lost no time in making them understand that I desired to be led into the presence of their king or ruler. This seemed to please them, but with many duckings of their heads, they withdrew a short distance and held a sort of powwow, after which one of their number, who seemed to be a sort of leader among them, and whose name, as I afterwards learned, was Go Whiz, advanced towards me with numerous low bendings of his body, and succeeded in informing me that their chief lived at a great distance from where we were, and that it would be necessary for me to remain here while they returned to the ruler to ask his permission to conduct me to him. I readily consented to such an arrangement. Go Whiz then led me to one of their dwellings, pointed out a bed of nice dry rushes, and invited me to make myself comfortable till he should come again to conduct me into the presence of their chief, Zitwish, as was the name he bore. Bulgar and I didn't wait for a second bidding, for we were tired to the bone after our long tramp. With half a dozen or more bows, quite as low as those made by Go Whiz and his companions, I began to make ready for a night's rest. For a moment or so I stood watching the retreating figures of these extraordinary people, who in single file, swiftly and noiselessly, like so many phantoms, had flitted away from the spot. Then, throwing myself down on the bed of rushes, called out to Bulgar to lie down by me. But he was not so trustful as I, and after caressing my hands, took up his position at the door of the dwelling, so as to save his little master from any treachery on the part of the phantom people. Day now went out suddenly, like a lamp quenched by the wind. Bulgar refused to sleep, but I, sheltered from the night dews by this thickly thatched roof, soon fell into a deep and refreshing sleep, out of which Bulgar found it difficult to arouse me, for I have a faint recollection of having felt him scratching at my arm for several moments ere I could shake off the fetters of sleep, which held me bound so tightly. Sitting up hastily, I discovered that Bulgar was patrolling the floor in a state of great excitement, pausing ever and anon to sniff the morning air, which, it was plain to be seen, brought him a warning of some kind. Instantly it occurred to me that the wild beasts were prowling about in the neighborhood. I examined the priming of my firearms. Bulgar looked well pleased to see that I was thoroughly aroused as to the threatening danger. He now grew bolder, and, springing out into the open air, made a circuit of the dwelling, only to return with bristling hair and growling out his suspicion that all was not right. His ever-increasing anxiety now began to cause me genuine alarm. I was upon the very point of making a hasty retreat to my vessel, when the thought flashed through my mind, what escape these swift-footed phantoms? It were idle to attempt it, so I determined to take my chances, come what might. The hut was strongly built, and its roof would at least protect us from a flight of poisoned arrows. While I was occupied in making a hasty survey of the place, a loud outcry from Bulgar startled me. I gave one look, and a shiver of fear zigzagged through my body. An armed band was full in sight. With fierce shouts, deep and rumbling, they came nearer and nearer. Their massive forms swayed from side to side, their huge limbs moved like walking oaks, their arms seemed the sturdy branches, ending in hands which, in the dim morning light, took the shape of gnarled and knotted knobs. Terrific strength was shadowed forth by their broad and heavy shoulders. One blow from a hand of such sledgehammer weight would lay a frail creature like me helpless in the dust. Bulgar, brave as he was, quailed at the sight. In an instant I collected my thoughts and breathed a last goodbye to the elder baron and to the gentle baroness, my mother, in their faraway home beneath the northern skies. Now they had reached the very doorway and stood beating their huge chests and giving forth deep, rumbling sounds. Instinctively I unsheathed my poniard and brandished it in the air. The effect was astonishing. With terrific cries, groans, and shouts, they fell back in the wildest terror, rolling over each other, bounding asunder like gigantic footballs, striking the earth and bounding into an erect position. When at last these human airbags settled down into something like rest, one of their number broke out into the most plaintive and beseeching speech, which I afterwards learned had about the following meaning: O master, O magician, O mysterious lump, O impenetrable chunk, put away that dread instrument, prick us not with its awful point. Pierce not our delicate skins. The slightest touch from that frightful blade would cause our bodies to burst like pricked balloons. Fear us not, we are thy friends. We come to conduct thee to our great chief. Zitwish, Zitwish, I am, go whiz, thy slave. Suddenly the truth broke in upon my wondering mind. There was no falsehood in the speaker's words. It was go whiz. The others were his companions, the wretched, woe-begone bags of bones who had parted with me only the day before. With a smile and gentle wave of the hand, I hastily returned my dagger to its sheath, and gave Go Wiz to understand that he had nothing to fear from me. Half crazed with curiosity, I now advanced to take a closer look at Go Wiz and his companions. Sober fact is it, when I tell you that they were, man for man, the selfsame beings I first fell in with on my starting out to explore the island. But this wonderful change, you ask? How had they, in one short night, grown to such Herculean build, arms and limbs as massive as those of Japanese wrestlers? I reply, it was all error. When I first met these gentlemen, they had not dined. Now, they had just come from a hearty meal. Now, you must know that I was now in the land of the wonderful wind eaters. When the air is calm and the winds asleep, these curious people are obliged to fast, and their skins hang in wrinkled bags, as I have described. But when the wind starts up for a mad frolic, or even a gentle puff and blow, these strange creatures at once begin to increase in size, and not long is it before every wrinkle and crease disappears like magic. As Go Wiz and his companion stood before me, I was struck by the ridiculous contrast between their voices and the expressions of their faces. Yesterday, with their fierce and forbidding faces, their voices were soft and flute-like. Today, their voices were terrible, deep, and rumbling, while their faces, now puffed out smooth and round, seemed wreathed in smiles and good humor. As I stood lost in wonder at the sight of these strangely transformed beings, Go Wiz rumbled out something which I easily understood to be a request that I should permit him to conduct me to the residence of his great chief, Satwish. I smiled assent, and set about gathering up my traps. Bulgar was completely nonplussed, and fixed his lustrous eyes upon me as much as to say, Dear little master, how canst thou trust thyself to these huge mountains of flesh, a single one of whom could crush thy frail body as easily as I would a mouse? I gave him a few caresses and stroked his silken coat to let him know I was sure that I was right. Go Wiz and his band, clumsy as they seemed, were by no means slow of pace. They moved forward at a brisk rate, for the air was calm, and they had little to carry. Now and then, upon bumping together, they bounded apart like rubber balls. It was a difficult thing for me to keep from laughing, especially when I saw Bulgar's look of utter perplexity. He rolled up his eyes at me in the most comical manner. However, at last we entered the village of the Wind Eaters, where the great chief, Satwish, held his court. He too was puffed out pretty round, although, as I afterwards learned, the laws of the land did not allow him to eat as heartily as his subjects. Here and there a wrinkle was visible. His face and arms didn't have that look of puffy tightness common to his people after a hearty meal. He had already been fully informed of my arrival on his island and of my extraordinary weight and hardness for my size. It took about 15 of the Wind Eaters to balance me in the scales. Chief Satwish received Bulgar and me with the greatest kindness. I was at once presented to his ministers of state and to the members of his family. Queen Thieu was a very stately dame, dignified and reserved in her manners, but the little princess, Poof Fa, charmed me with her childlike curiosity. Well, as I said, isn't Mr. Baron 8 in this story? Their excellencies, the ministers of state, stood behind. their master and seemed intent upon giving him far more advice than he was willing to listen to. Their names were Hissa, Rudder, and Shaboom. You may well imagine the excitement created in the home of Chief Zitwish by my arrival. From the highest to the lowest, from chief to serving man, everyone begged and implored to be allowed to feel of me. Anxious to make a favorable impression upon the strange people so that I might have a good opportunity to study them at my ease, I submitted good-naturedly for an hour or more to being patted, pinched, prodded, rubbed, and stroked. It were vain for me to attempt to give you any idea of the 1,001 outcries of surprise, delight, wonder, fear, anxiety, and dread which went up from this multitude of strange beings who were, although they didn't seem to think so, quite as great curiosities to me as I to them. My stock of dried fruit was now quite exhausted, and I began to feel the gnawings of hunger. I was always blessed with a splendid appetite, and the pure, bracing air of this island only added to it. Bulgar, too, I could see, was casting inquiring glances about in search of some signs of kitchen arrangements. I made known to the chief Zitwish, as well as I could, the state of affairs, and he at once summoned Hissa, Whir, and Shaboom to his side for a consultation. They held a most animated discussion, and one too which ran from a quarter hour to quarter hour without any sign of coming to an end. All this time my poor stomach was wondering what had cut off the customary supplies. Like rulers the world over, Chief Zitwish was impatient and self-willed. Finally he lost his temper completely and moved about so vigorously that his 3 ministers were kept continually on the bounce, so to speak. If you can only wait long enough, everything comes to an end. I was finally bidden to approach the chief, who asked me whether I had, since my arrival on his island, seen anything which I could eat. I was obliged to confess that I had not, whereupon there was another consultation which ended in Zitwish seizing his corkwood club and sending each one of his ministers in a different direction. With 3 quick smart blows, the sight was so ludicrous that I would willingly have let my dinner go for a chance at the bat myself. Suddenly an idea came to me. I could see that this settlement of the Wind-Eaters was not far from the seashore, so as best I could, I made Chief Zitwish comprehend that I could eat the oysters and other shellfish, of which I'd noticed vast quantities lying on the white sands of the ocean. When the thing was made thoroughly plain to them that I proposed to satisfy my hunger by devouring such horrid and disgusting creatures as lived between these shells, I was really alarmed at the consternation it caused. Queen Fu Yu and Princess Poof Fa were taken ill and withdrew to their apartments in great haste, while one and all, even including the fierce Go Wiz, were seized with symptoms of nausea. By degrees, however, they recovered, and orders were issued to 6 serving men who, not being gorged, were in good marching condition to set out for the shore and bring a supply of the shellfish to appease my hunger, which by this time had really set its teeth in my vitals. Meanwhile, Bulgar and I were conducted to a neat bamboo dwelling with an umbrella-shaped roof, and left to ourselves until the supply of food should arrive. I was too hungry to sleep, and Bulgar too was in the same condition, but he was patience itself, as he always is when he knows that his little master is suffering. I threw myself down on a heap of dried rushes, and my loving companion came and pillowed his head on my arm. After a tedious wait of an hour or so, a great outcry told me that something unusual had happened in the village of the Wind-Eaters. It was the arrival of the serving men bringing the supply of oysters. I could hardly restrain myself until Chief Sitwish to summon me to break my long fast. When I reached the chief's quarters, I found a vast crowd of people assembled to see the lump man put solid things down his throat. Chief Sitwish and his court occupied front seats. As you know, by this time, the voice of a wind-eater depends on the condition he is in. If he has just eaten and his body is rounded out like a well-filled balloon, his voice is deep and rumbling. If, on the other hand, he has not taken food for a day or so, and his skin hangs in folds and wrinkles on his framework of bones, he speaks with a soft, flute-like tone. As I stepped to the front, followed by Bulgar, and took my place beside the heap of oysters, a deafening outcry went up, in which the deep roars of the inflated wind-eaters were mingled with the soft, flute-like tones of the fasting ones. Not noticing any instrument at hand with which to pry the shells open, I thoughtlessly drew my poniard from its sheath. In an instant, a terrible panic seized upon the assembled multitude. Queen Fu Yu and the Princess Pufa fell into a swoon. Chief Sitwich, being in a fasting condition, darted away to his apartments like a phantom. The minister's estate, Elisa, what was it? Hitsaw, I guess misprint. Wur and Shaboom, being puffed up to the fullest capacity, struck the ground with their feet and rolled out of the way like huge footballs. Quick as though I sheathed my dagger, the sight of whose glittering point had brought about this consternation, and profiting by the lessons given me at our first meeting by Go Wiz and his companions, I began a series of head duckings and walking motions of my body, which soon restored confidence in my peaceful intentions and brought my scattered audience back to their seats. Go Wiz, who had run the farthest, was now loudest in his boasts that he had not been the least frightened. Chief Sitwish resumed his seat with considerable nerve, but I noticed that he kept his eyes fastened on the place where I had hidden my dagger and my belt. Although the sight of the toothsome oysters only served to whet my appetite, yet I was now terribly perplexed to know how I should pry the shells open, for the laws of the land of the wind-eaters visited the death penalty upon anyone found with a sharp-pointed instrument in his possession. In earliest childhood, the fingernails are kept pared down to the flesh until they lose their power to grow hard, and their place is taken by a piece of tough skin. Teeth. The wind-eaters have none, or more correctly speaking, their teeth do not grow above their gums. Nature seemed to have gradually ceased taking the trouble to supply these people with something for which they had absolutely no use. You must bear in mind that these curious people had not always been satisfied with such thin diet. In ancient times, so Chief Sitwish informed me that their ancestors had been fruit eaters. The fruits, however, falling, they had been forced to have recourse to the gums which flowed from the trees, and as these gradually dried up, they made discovery that the various winds which blew across the island were filled with some invisible germs or particles which had the power of sustaining life. To resume, observing a flint hatchet lying on the ground, I laid hold of it and set to work opening one of the largest oysters. A deep silence settled upon the assemblage. With a skillful twist, I wrenched the upper shell off, and raising the lower one, upon which the fat and luscious creature lay unmindful of his impending fate, I opened my mouth and gracefully let the dainty morsel slip out of sight. 100 cries of half horror, half wonder broke like a great chorus from the surrounding crowds of wind-eaters. Again and again this outburst died away, only to break forth once more with redoubled vigor. Many of the lookers-on were made so seriously ill by this, to them, most extraordinary spectacle, that they hastily left the place before I was able to take a second mouthful. You may fancy how they felt, about as you would Were I to begin gulping down bits of stone and iron, quick few you clung timorously to her husband's arm, but the Princess Poof-Faw stepped boldly nearer to me, so that she might have a better view of the little man, solid all through. Again I raised one of the largest shells and let its occupant slip noiselessly down my throat, not forgetting each time to loosen the white muscle which held the shells together for Bulgar's share of the feast. Gradually, the qualms of the wind-eaters at sight of a human being swallowing food in lumps gave place to a devouring curiosity on their part to draw nearer and to get a better view of my manner of satisfying hunger. I could understand enough to know that many of the wind-eaters had serious doubts that I really swallowed the oysters. To them, I was little less than some sort of sleight-of-hand man, or doer of tricks. The little Princess Poof-Faw mounted upon one of the benches, and the instant the oyster disappeared down my throat, insisted upon my opening my mouth to its greatest width, in order that she might take a look for herself and see if the oyster were not hidden away under my tongue or in my cheek somewhere. A sudden scream of terror startled the onlookers as much as it did me. The little princess was carried away in a swoon. It was my teeth. They had frightened the gentle Poof-Faw half to death. For a moment all was confusion. Encouraged by Go Whiz, many of the wind-eaters seized their clubs and pressed forward with murderous intent. The reappearance of Princess Poof-Faw, bright and smiling, set everything right again. The crowd now was seized with unconquerable curiosity to draw near and take a look for themselves at the terrible thing which had thrown Poof-Faw into a swoon. My jaws soon began to ache from stretching my mouth wide enough open to give each one of them a glance at my double row of ivory cutters and grinders, and if I do say it myself, I had in those days one of the finest sets of teeth that ever cut their way through a slice of Nienberg biscuit or ground up a piece of German roast goose. From now on, these childlike and simple-minded people became pretty thoroughly convinced that the little man, thick all through, was a kind and peaceful creature, in every way perfectly harmless. The children flocked about me, and encouraged by my smiles and head-duckings, soon made friends with me. I was glad of this, for I was anxious to make a close study of the wind-eaters, young and old. You may judge of my surprise when I saw a bevy of these children, animated puffballs that they were, engaged in the, to them, novel sport of rushing full tilt at me and bouncing off like rubber balls from a board fence. Well, I suppose you are bursting with curiosity to hear something more definite about these strange people. To me, they were not entirely unknown. I had read here and there ancient books of travel by Arabian authors of some such a race, whose bodies were so frail that they were unable to partake of any stronger and heavier food than the sweet gums which flowed from the trees, and whose skins were so transparent that they were called glass-bodied. The beating of their little hearts being plainly visible to the eye of the beholder, I have no doubt that these authors referred to the dwellers of this wonderful island, on which no fruits, berries, or edible roots were to be found. At least not ones they knew about, right? I mean, if it was real. And whose ancestors, as I was informed by Chief Sitwish, did in former ages thus sustain their lives. But I must confess that the fact that there were in existence human beings who literally lived upon air, or more correctly speaking, upon winds laden with some invisible particles of life-sustaining matter, was a little more than I had ever dared to dream out, even in the most active workings of my imagination. You may judge then of my delight upon finding myself among these extraordinary people, and upon discovering them to be such true children of nature, mild-mannered and peacefully inclined. And yet I was not long in making a discovery which proved to be quite an important one to me. It was this: I learned that although the truth was as I have stated it, that the wind-eaters are as a rule a race of peace-loving creatures, gentle in their dispositions and adverse to wrongdoing, yet there were exceptions to this general rule. Strange to say, it depended on what wind they fed upon. All the women, for instance, were gentleness itself. They fed upon the soft zephyrs of the south. But the great majority of these people contented themselves with satisfying their hunger by resorting to the strong and wholesome west wind, while a goodly number, from some idea that it had a sweeter and more delicate flavor, a sort of heavy, nut-like taste, preferred the fitful, irregular east wind. It was, however, not considered wholesome diet by the best physicians of the nation, and they contended that those who made a habit of feeding upon this wind were never as hale and hearty as those who restricted themselves entirely to the nutritious and bracing west wind. A few there were, as in every land there are those who delight in strong rich food, who insisted upon feeding on the rugged, gusty northwest wind, claiming that it was best suited to their wants, and that nature had intended man to partake of a wind powerful and strong-bodied in order to fit them for the battle of life. There were even some, a very few, be it said, to the honor of these mild-mannered and peace-loving people, who, contrary to the laws of the land and the express commands of Chief Zitwish, welcomed the blowing of the angry, whistling, boisterous north wind, and drank in the dangerous fluid until their better natures were completely changed, and from being gentle, timorous, and peace-loving, they became rough and quarrelsome. To this ilk belonged Captain Gowiz. In fact, as I was told by Chief Zitwish himself showed signs of fear when he saw Gowiz come swaggering into the village, his eyes inflamed, his steps unsteady, his speech indistinct after a heavy meal upon the rude and buffeting wind of the north. While in this condition, Gowiz lost the slight control he had over himself, and had upon one occasion so forgotten himself as to breathe out threats in defiance against Chief Zitwish, driving that ruler out of his own apartments by advancing upon him with a bit of flint which he had ground to a dangerously sharp point. Such were the curious people among whom I now found myself sojourning, and on terms of pleasant intimacy with the ruler. A few days after my arrival at the village of the Wind-Eaters, I was unfortunately the innocent cause of rather a grave incident, which for a while had the effect of making me somewhat unpopular at the court of Chief Zitwish. It all came about in this way. I've already told you how quick the children were to discover the solidity of my body, and what delight they took in throwing themselves against me full tilt in order to have the sport of bouncing off again like so many rubber balls. Now, you must keep in mind the fact that even after a hearty meal, a whole dozen of these babies weighed about 1 good pound. I used to encourage them to play about me in order the better to observe the curious tricks and ways, one of which was to lock arms and legs and thus form a chain of human links, one of which being fastened to a peak of the roof, and the other possibly to some high staff or pole, at times even extending across the street, and ending on the roof of the opposite dwelling. Thus festooned, they spent hours swaying to and fro in the cool of the day, often swinging themselves to sleep. And it was not at all an unusual thing to see one of the mothers, in search of her child, come bustling along, halt, take down the line of living links, unhook her baby, replace the line, and hurry away home. While seated one day on the balcony of one of Chief Zitwish's cottages, a dozen or more of the children set to work to form such a chain, one end of it being fastened to one of my earrings, which, like a good sailor, I took pleasure in wearing at times, and the other, reaching nearly to the ground, passing over the high rail of the balcony, scrambling, pushing, and squirming, uttering the queerest cries, shouts, and squeals. These tiny wind-eaters were half wild with joy. When suddenly one of those nearest me swung against the point of a needle which I had doubtlessly thrust into the lapel of my coat the last time I had been doing some mending, for, like a true sailor, I was skilled in the use of needle and thread. I was aroused from my dreamy contemplation of these fantastic beings by a sharp crack, like that made by the bursting of a toy balloon. Again and again, the same sharp noise rang in my ear. A glance was sufficient to explain it all. I could feel my hair bristling up with horror as I saw the living links of this chain snap asunder one after the other and disappear into thin air, exploded by coming into contact with the needle point. The force of the explosion of the first of these tiny puffballs of humanity had been sufficient to burst the baby next in the line, and so on to the end of the chain. A dozen of them gone in less than as many seconds, and not so much as a lock of hair to carry home to the heartbroken mothers. In a few moments, the news of the accident had spread to every quarter of the village. The weeping, shrieking mothers, howling for vengeance, gathered quickly about the dwelling into the interior of which Bulgar and I had retreated. Now, you may believe me when I say that I would not have stood in the least dread of an army of the wind-eaters when they were fully inflated after a hearty meal. But it so happened that the air had been calm for a day or so, and that many of them were now shrunken to the living skeleton size in which I had first met them. In this condition, they were foes not to be despised, for, moving as they did with almost lightning rapidity, their mode of fighting was to entangle their enemy in fine nets woven of bamboo fiber, and then beat them to death with their clubs. True, these clubs were made of corkwood, and a score of them weighed less than a pound. Yet this fact would only make death slower and more painful, for while a few blows might suffice to put one of their kind out of his misery, it would most surely have required a whole day for them to beat the life out of such a solid enemy as I was. Before I had chanced to collect my thoughts, Go Wiz was at the door with his band, their nets coiled to throw over me, while behind the net throwers stood a row of club bearers, anxiously awaiting their turn to begin proceedings. Thought I to myself, this is serious business. If Chief Zitwish is not at hand, they will entangle me in their nets and try to beat the life out of me before he returns, for they well know his affection for me. But worst than all was the fact that Go Wiz had just returned from a distant part of the island, whither he and a few of his chums had made a secret journey in order to gorge themselves on the rude and boisterous northwest wind. He was full of swagger and ire. I had never seen him swollen to such a size. His voice sounded like the deep bellowing of some fierce animal. He whirled his net in the air and called out in thundering tones for his men to follow him. I felt now that the moment had arrived for me to make a desperate effort to save my life, and Bulgar's too, for, with his 4 feet twisted up in one of their nets, he would fall an easy prey to Go Wiz and his band. I felt, too, that it would be worse than useless to appeal to Go Wiz for mercy, influenced as he was by long and deep draughts of the fierce and raging northwest gale. There he stood, puffing, blowing, blustering, swaggering, as round and round his head he swung the fatal web, which, the moment I should attempt to take my back from the wall, he intended to cast over me as a fowler would entrap a bird. Suddenly I bethought myself of the little instrument which had brought me to this dangerous strait. Before drawing it, however, from its hiding place, I determined to play the bully and swagger a little myself. Now the heaviest wind-eater weighs about 6 pounds, and as you may imagine, my weight, nearly 100 pounds, was a source of great dread to them. They stood in constant fear that I might accidentally tread upon one of the toes of a wind-eater and explode him. Before they would allow me to venture out upon one of their balconies or to inhabit an upper story of one of their dwellings, they proceeded to strengthen it with the stoutest bamboo poles they could find. So now I began to give the valiant Go Wiz a few gentle reminders of my weight and solidity. Leaping high into the air, I landed upon the bamboo flooring with such a thump that everything creaked and trembled. At first there was a general stampede of Go Wiz's followers, and that blustering leader was the only one left to face Bulgar and me. He stood his ground pretty bravely, although I could see that he was half inclined to heed the cries of his men and make his way out of the dwelling before I succeeded in wrecking it. But after a few more of my jumps, seeing that the flooring withstood all my efforts to break it down, Go Wiz succeeded in rallying his band. Again, and now more furious than ever, they surrounded us, shrieking and howling like mad, their uplifted right hands bearing the dangerous nets with which they hoped to entangle Bulgar and me, and then dispatch us. Now it was high time for me to fall back on my reserves. I did so. The effect was simply astounding. The needle proved to be one of the kind used for darning, very long and bright and exceedingly sharp-pointed. My dagger point was bad enough. It had thrown them into wild and panicky fear, but this little instrument, as I brandished it in front of them, threw them into fits of rigid terror. They stood rooted to the ground, their bulging eyes riveted upon the needle point, as if they, one and all, expected it to prick them to death if they stirred an inch. At last, making a mighty effort, Go Wiz broke away from the spot, uttering a deep and rumbling cry of horror, his men rolling after him in the wildest terror when they saw the tumultuous manner in which the valiant Go Wiz and his followers retreated from my presence. The assembled men and women, with frightful cries, took to their heels as if a legion of demons were pursuing them. In a few moments, Bulgar and I stood alone on the battlefield. He had not budged from my side during the time that death threatened him. "Come," said I, as I stooped and stroked his head. "Come, thou faithful friend and companion. Let us go to Chief Ztwish and lay the matter before him." The chief had just awoke from a noonday nap. He had calmly slept through the whole conflict and so it was necessary for me to give him a full account of the unfortunate accident which resulted in exploding an entire string of babies, and of Go Wiz's attempt to slay me. He listened with great calmness, and most patiently too. He then begged to be excused for a few moments, as an attendant had just informed him that a very soft and sweet south wind had begun to blow. He stepped out on the balcony, and after he had taken about a dozen mouthfuls of the pure, refreshing breeze, returned looking a little plumper, and like all men after enjoying a meal of favorite food, was still more amiable and kindly in his manner than before. The news that a dozen of the smallest subjects had been so unceremoniously popped out of existence didn't seem to worry him very much. What moved him most of all was the fact which apparently, up to that hour, had never entered into his mind, namely that a point so fine, so delicate, so deadly, so nearly invisible, could be created by the hand of man. I assured him that it was that very moment hidden in the stuff of my garb, right in front of his eyes. He trembled. I strove to reassure him by explaining to him that I would as soon think of plunging my poniard into my own heart as of turning this almost invisible and yet deadly point against his life. He tried to smile, but it ended in a shudder. Thinkest thou, little man, thick all through, acts chief Zitwish, with a trembling tongue, that I may look upon it and not fall into a swoon? Almost assuredly, great chief, was my reply. In fact, most light and buoyant Zitwish, I continued, I can rob this dreaded instrument of all its power to injure thee, and place it in thy hand like any harmless bit of wood. Is it thy will that I should thus deliver to thee this dreaded point? With a slight shiver, Chief Zitwish made answer. A great and learned little master. I think I can bear the sight of it now. I am indeed very brave, but thou knowest a single prick of that deadly point would instantly end the life of the sturdiest wind-eater. I again assured him that there was really nothing to dread so long as he followed my directions. So saying, I drew the darning needle from its hiding place. Chief Zitwish closed his eyes at first, but gradually grew bold enough to gaze upon the glittering point. Stooping down, I picked up one of the cork clubs, and breaking off a bit of the smaller end, thrust the needle point into it. Chief Zitwish watched my movements with a sort of painful curiosity. There, great chief of the wind-eaters, I exclaimed, now thou mayest toy with it. Hide it in the rushes of thy bed, it cannot injure thee. It is as harmless as a pebble rounded by the sportive, sparkling waters of one of thy mountain brooks. Take it. It may serve thee some day in case of a sudden attack upon thy illustrious person. At such a moment, fear not, seize it firmly, draw its dreaded point from its hiding place in this bit of cork. So small is it that it will be invisible in thy hand, and while thine enemy stands before thee in fancied safety, pierce him to death, for thou art ruler, and it is fitting that death should strike him who attempts to rob thy people of their chief. Chief Zitwish took the needle with the trembling hand and hid the bit of cork which held it under the thatch of the roof. Then, calling out, he summoned one of his serving men and bade him bring from a neighboring apartment a certain small bamboo chest, from which he drew a string of rare jewels, somewhat of the nature of amber, only 1,000 times more brilliant. With this beautiful gift, he dismissed me, issuing orders to his ministers that no harm should be allowed to come to me for the accident which exploded the string of little wind-eaters. Go Wiz could, with difficulty, hide his anger at seeing me once more an honored guest at the court of Chief Zitwish. I did not relax my vigilance in the least, however. Every night I barred the windows with my own hands and placed Bulgar's mat of rushes in front of the door, so that it would be impossible for the wrathful leader to surprise me. Now that the explosion of the babies was quite forgotten, my sojourn among the wind-eaters would have continued to be extremely pleasant had not a new difficulty arisen to cause me anxiety. The rather thin diet upon which I had been existing since my arrival among these curious people, while it appeased my hunger, robbed me of that plump and well-fed look which I always had. I found myself losing flesh at an alarming rate. Chief Zitwish, and Queen Fu Yu were delighted, for as they expressed it, the little man, thick all through, was rapidly becoming, in appearance at least, a genuine wind-eater. Bulgar, too, fell away dreadfully. Now and then I surprised him with his dark, lustrous eyes fixed upon me, with as much as to say, "Oh, little master, what is the matter with us? We eat, and yet we grow thin. Are we really turning to wind-eaters?" And another bad phase of the matter was, that while my ever-increasing leanness was causing me so much anxiety, it was carrying joy to the heart of Queen Fu Yu, who, it seems, had formed the plan of keeping me for the rest of my life in the service of her lord and master by bestowing upon me the hand of the fair princess Poof Fa. Queen Fu Yu's explanation of my ever-increasing thinness was that it was the effect of the wonderful atmosphere of their island, that it mattered very little how thick and solid a man might be if he lived long enough among them. He would gradually lose it, and become, if not a genuine wind-eater, at least almost as light and airy a being as they were. As I learned of these views from others before hearing them from the Queen's own lips, it was not at all a surprise for me one day to receive a message from the stately Fu Yu summoning me to present myself before her. She accorded me a very gracious reception, and Princess Poof Fa, too, showed great delight at seeing me under her mother's roof. She bounced hither and thither like a toy balloon, now shaking perfume from dried flowers, now holding up strings of the curious gems which I have already mentioned, and making them glisten in front of my face. I amused her by holding her out on the palm of my hand and tossing her up and catching her as I would a rubber ball. Queen Fu Yu looked on in mute satisfaction. When Princess Poof Fa had grown weary of play, the Queen spoke as follows: "O little man, thick all through, I have to say to thee that which will gladden thy heart. The great chief, my husband, and I have noticed with joy that day by day thou art growing thinner and thinner. Know then that this is the magical effect of the air thou breathest. When our forefathers landed on this island, they, like thee, were solid all through. Therefore, be not alarmed when a few months hence thou findest thyself completely changed. Thou wilt ere long lose this heavy load of useless flesh, which thou hast been for so long a time condemned to carry about with thee, and become light and buoyant like us. And O beloved lump, that thou mayest hasten the change from thy present solid form and become a graceful and hollow being like one of us, I do, with the chief Zitwish's counsel and consent, accord thee permission to eat with us each day. This very hour shalt thou make thy first meal upon the sweet and wholesome wind of the south. The very moment, little chunk, that thou hast become thin enough to suit the great chief, he will give thee the fair princess Poof Fa for thy wife." At these words, the princess, who really seemed to be very fond of me, clapped her hands joyfully and bounced between her mother and me like a toy football. "But, little man lump," continued Queen Fu Yu, "before we set out to dine on the sweet wind which blows over Banquet Hall, there are two things which the great chief Sitwish said, I must be very particular to mention to you the two conditions upon which he is willing to honor you above all men by bestowing the hand of the beautiful Princess Poof-Fa upon thee. Name them, gracious queen, I cried, for I was too wise to raise any objections. At this point, I knew only too well that a single word from Chief Sitwish would hand me over to the tender mercies of the fierce Go-Wiz. They are, resumed the queen, Fu-Yu, puffing out her cheeks, tapping them playfully with the backs of her thumbs. They are, little man, thick all through, that thou shalt file thy teeth down, even with thy gums, and keep thy nails always pared down to the flesh. It shall be, gracious queen, as thou desirest, I replied with several low bendings of my body. Then answered Queen Fu-Yu gaily, there remains nothing for thee to do but to begin at once to accustom thyself to our food. So let us set out for the banquet hill without delay, for the sweet south wind is blowing fresh and strong. I accompanied Queen Fu-Yu and Princess Poof-Fa to the place indicated. It was a beautiful knoll from which I could look far away to the southward over a valley enchantingly fair. She and the princess at once began to inhale the soft, sweet air and encouraged me to do the same.